Hey everyone, welcome back to our leadership series. You might recall that the month of June is dedicated to moving from managing to coaching. In 1974, a tennis coach by the name of Timothy Galway wrote a book entitled The Inner Game of Tennis. He probably didn't realize it at the time, but his book would eventually become the seminal work for modern coaching. What made Galway's approach to coaching so different and so unique was his emphasis on non-judgmental awareness and encouraging self-trust as paths to excellence in both sports and in life. Galway would eventually write 5 books in total and would become the founder of the Inner Game Institute, where he's consulted global giants like Apple, Coca-Cola, AT&T, and IBM, just to name a few. So what radical idea did this tennis coach from California come up with that so profoundly altered the way that we coach others for success? Well, he noticed that his students learned and performed best when they quieted that inner critic, that voice in our head that most of us know quite well, and learned to trust in their abilities and their instincts and their training. And so he framed this theory within a very simple formula. Performance equals potential minus interference. Galway's first book was focused on tennis, but he would eventually recognize that his ideas were far more universal, and they extended into other areas of our lives, such as work and stress management. Referred to as the godfather of modern coaching, he redefined the coach's role from being an instructor to being a facilitator of self-discovery. Years later, his theory would inspire Sir John Whitmore to develop a very popular coaching framework called GROW, G-R-O-W, which was designed to help leaders evolve from telling other people what to do to helping them think through challenges on their own. And research shows that implementing the GROW framework into an organization can have long-lasting positive impact because it pushes all members of the team to reach their highest potential. At its core, this framework asserts that good managers solve problems, but great managers, leaders, develop problem solvers. So instead of regularly telling people what to do, a leader using the GROW method asks questions designed to help other people arrive at their own solution. Let's break down the acronym. The G stands for goal, and key questions we'd ask here are, well, what are you trying to achieve? What do you hope to accomplish? Maybe what does a good outcome look like? Imagine that an employee comes up to you and says something like, I'm really struggling with this customer relationship. With the GROW framework, instead of immediately offering guidance or strategies or specific steps to take, you simply ask, well, what would a successful relationship with this customer look like? Here's the impact of that. First, the conversation immediately shifts from complaining about a problem to creating or defining a desired outcome or goal, and this is healthy. But secondly, you are now able to listen to the thought process and the logic of your direct report, which is also very healthy. The R in GROW stands for reality. We're trying to establish the immediate context. What's happening now? What's working and not working? Or maybe even what have you tried? In this spot, we're looking for a status update in the most objective way possible. But it's important to accomplish this by still asking questions and not slipping into the old habits of, giving advice. So using the example that we had earlier, now the employee says that this struggling relationship with a customer, I've tried 3 times and I've received no response. The opportunity here now to better understand the reality of the situation without jumping to conclusions, without offering solutions, is to begin to ask questions. Well, what might contribute to this lack of response? And I'll tell you what, after you get an answer, ask what else, because there's sure to be more there. And you and your direct report might be surprised at how much that they've already learned once they begin to share more details about the situation as it currently stands. O stands for options, and the key questions here are, what could you do differently? Or if there were no constraints, what would you try? One of my favorite questions is, if our roles were reversed, what would you advise me to do? The whole point of asking questions here is to lead this other person towards self-discovery and a solution from within. That's the whole point of the framework. And at O is when we begin to shift the responsibility for thinking and action in a more obvious direction toward our direct report. They've verbally processed the reasons why they're feeling ghosted by a customer. And now the follow-up question here is something like, well, what are 3 possible ways to move this forward? With O, the emphasis is on finding solutions, but that solution is still a responsibility of the other person. W could stand for will or way forward. I've seen it in two different ways. The key question we're asking is, well, what's next, right? What option are you going to try first? What's step one? Or maybe even when will you start? This is where we establish accountability. Another favorite question here is, how will you know if you're successful? Ultimately, what you're trying to do with this part of the conversation is to bring it to a conclusion where there's an understanding that a task needs to be accomplished and that follow-up will be happening. So let's conclude by returning to Gallwey and Whitmore. Gallwey's out there in the tennis courts, and he's noticing that the more a coach yells directions and instructions like move your feet or get your elbow higher, follow through in that shot next time, all of that it almost operates like noise. The more of that's happening, the worse the athletes are performing. And so he would go on and develop a popular theory that basically says a person's performance improves when natural self-awareness increases and outside interference and noise decreases. And years later, Whitmore takes this idea and says, this isn't just true about tennis, it's true about organizations everywhere. Think about the 1970s. Most of your organizations were designed as run-of-the-mill, top-down hierarchies where managers were expected to act like old-school coaches. Employees would bring problems to the manager would tell them what to do. If the manager didn't know what to do, she would take it up a level higher in the chain of command to her manager. And then if he knew the answer, he would give it to her, and down it flows. And that approach eventually solved problems, as they travel up and down the corporate ladder based on level of importance. But that approach is also highly inefficient. And even worse, it really leaves an organization exposed when someone who has almost all or most of the answers quits or retires or is fired or, God forbid, dies. You can see how a framework like GROW might sound revolutionary in the 1970s, but here we are all these years later, and it's still not as universal as you might expect. Allow me to share one more anecdote if I can. In education, teachers have traditionally been categorized into 4 categories or tiers: novice, beginner, developing, proficient, and distinguished. The day I went from 3 to 4 was the day I realized I'm not supposed to model being the expert in the room with all the answers. I'm supposed to model being the curious person in the room with all the questions. When I was younger, I thought finding the answer was the point of education, and I was wrong. The discovery of an answer is the point of education. And after I accepted this shift in responsibility, I became a much better teacher. Because now when a student asked me to help solve a problem, I would respond with a question of my own. Well, first, can you tell me how you're thinking about it? One of my favorite questions was, can you walk me through your thought process so far? Because in that moment, I'm not any less involved in providing the student with a possible answer. In fact, I'm even more involved than if I had just given them one, because now I'm a facilitator and I'm a passenger on their journey towards solving the problem. I'm not taking the wheel. I'm just pointing out potential exits and interesting landmarks as we go. And I really feel strongly that we should take the same approach with leadership. We need to evolve from being managers to being facilitators. We need to switch from telling someone, you should do this, or you should do that. And we should instead ask them, what are you trying to achieve? What's happening right now? What options do you have? And what will you do next?